Just over 2 years ago, feels like another age, pre-COVID times, Mim and I went on a rally. We don't normally go on rallies, do Mim and I, but this one was about safeguarding the planet. And it was led by the children of our communities. It was midweek. They had gone on strike. Do you remember that? When all the kids came out of school and went on strike? Striking because they wanted to raise their voices, to make them heard, to tell people around how important climate change was to them. And we all assembled, it was in Carlisle, we all assembled in the big market square, and various children got up to speak and address a crowd that was growing by the time, in number constantly. And I remember one girl, gosh, she'd be about 10, and she stood up on this podium, got in front of the microphone, and she didn't say much, but this is what she said. Enough is enough. The time to act is now. Please save my future. Powerful words. Today, as I'm speaking, there's a group of young people who are part of the Young Christian Climate Network walking. They're walking from Land's End. They began, do you remember when the world leaders gathered in Cornwall a few months ago? They began then, and they've been walking ever since, bless them. And they're walking all the way to Glasgow, to the COP26, which is happening in November. And as they go, they're seeking to inspire, to motivate local communities to engage with the issue of climate change. They're young Christians from all churches, all denominations, aged between 18 and 30, and they are choosing to follow Jesus in pursuit of climate justice. And this is what they are saying. We are for a system that no longer relies on exploitation of people, communities and the earth, because for us, following Jesus means following his radical call to love and care for our neighbours, and this includes seeking climate justice. In our gospel reading today, we've heard Jesus inviting his followers to become like children as they seek to follow him ever more faithfully. Just to put his remarks into a bit of context, the disciples have been thrown into a bit of a turmoil, in a bit of a tiz they were. Because Jesus' remarks that he's going to suffer and die and rise again were not what they thought they'd signed up to. This was not the path to prestige and victory that they thought they were on. And so in the midst of them trying to grapple with this, they start to bicker. And their bickering sounds very much like the kind of bickering I recall from my childhood in a playground, where you sort of say, well, my dad's bigger than your dad. And into the midst of that bickering, Jesus brings a child. And he gathers this child into his arms. And he totally upends his disciples' notions of what is truly great and what is truly powerful. Because he says this: whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Now, if I wasn't a parent, and if I didn't have 25 years behind me of being a social worker working with children and young people in the safeguarding and care system, I might have been tempted to sentimentalise Jesus' words here. I might have assumed that Jesus was inviting us to embrace the innocence of childhood. But the children that I know and the children that I knew were anything but innocent. They were feisty, they were clever, they're quick, they're fierce, they're generous, they're selfish, they're naughty, they're obedient, they're curious. They're bored, they're quiet, they're loud, they're challenging, funny, surprising, creative, destructive, solemn and exhausting. Jesus was never a one for donning rose-tinted spectacles, so I'm assuming that he knew what children were like when he said those words, when he described children as trustworthy representatives of God. So in the context of the challenges we're facing today as a community, as a society, as a nation, as a global community, what might it mean to follow in the footsteps of our children? How do our children and young people inspire us to open ourselves ever more deeply and more authentically to God and to our neighbours and to his world? Here are some of the thoughts that I had. Children show us that our imaginations are pathways to God. I remember once, a few years ago now, telling a godly story, a godly play story, and some of you will know what that method looks like. And it was the story of creation, and there was a group of kids around, just absolutely captivated. And when we got to the bit of the story where we were inviting the kids to wonder, I was bowled over. I was bowled over by some of their remarks. One little girl in particular said, "Do you know, we all need one another, don't we?" Out of the mouths of babes. In our gospel reading, Jesus invites the disciples to imagine a world where death doesn't have the final word, where inexpressible suffering gives way to irrepressible joy, where resurrection isn't merely a promise, a possibility, but it's a promise guaranteed by God. But the disciples are struggling to make that leap. Welcome the child, Jesus says in response. Open your imaginations. Return to the capacity to wonder, to treasure. That capacity that you knew when you were a child. We all know those children who are forever asking questions. I remember one of my nephews going through such a phase. I can't remember how old he would have been. Do you remember, Gray? I think he was somewhere around about 4 or 5 at the time. Matthew, I'm thinking of. And anything you said to him, he would follow it up with, "Why?" Now, initially, that was quite cute, until it carried on and on and on, and I started to get rather exasperated. But looking back, all those years ago, actually, what he was doing was a real gift. He was asking questions that made me think. Because children do that, don't they? They're not afraid to ask questions, generally. Even impossible questions, they have this natural, innate curiosity. And they're not embarrassed by their ignorance. They're really, really willing to experience even social discomfort as long as they get the answer. And if they don't understand something, they persevere until they do. When it comes to climate change, our children and young people are asking questions, challenging questions. What are you going to do about it? When are you going to take this seriously? Why are you not throwing everything you have, even the kitchen sink, at this life-changing issue? There's something else children and young people have to offer us. Children teach us to trust God's abundance. Young children, but not all, expect that there is enough to go around. Enough time, enough hugs, enough attention, enough love. It doesn't occur to them to think scarcity. We spend so much time when our children are young teaching them to share. Yet it seems to me that our children understand this better than we do. Today they're asking us to share, to trust that creation will provide enough for all of our needs, if only we will use its resources wisely, non-possessively, and generously. Children teach us to imagine. Children teach us to ask questions. And children teach us to trust in God's abundance. As we continue to reflect and engage with the issues of climate change, we could do a lot worse than follow in the footsteps of our children and young people. I'd like to end my reflection today by just citing a passage taken from the Young Christians Climate Network. And these are the values they're seeking to embody. Let's listen to what they are saying. Our commitment to climate change stems not from fear or guilt, but from our love for God, for our neighbours, and for creation. Love informs all of our interactions. We are unafraid to challenge the attitudes of ourselves and others, but we do so remembering the value of everyone we meet. We follow Christ's servant heart, and we engage positively in creative, outward-focused love. Amazing words. Let's be like children.